Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to U.S. History Through Film as we look at the video worksheet that accompanies the Berlin Airlift. Number 3, in which the Western Allies wanted to revive the German economy while the Soviets wanted communist planning, basically describes the Marshall Plan and the Soviet 5-year plans that managed their economies. Number 15. We see that during World War II, General William Tunner had flown supplies over the Himalaya Mountains to help anti-communist forces in China. And this is important because while we don't often talk about it, Chinese forces had kept at least 1 million Japanese soldiers tied down, so they couldn't oppose American forces in the Pacific. But after the Japanese captured Southeast Asia, there was no way to ship supplies into China by land, especially after the Soviet Union and Japan signed a neutrality pact so that no supplies could be shipped to Japan's enemies through the Soviet Union. At least officially, all the Soviets, in fact, supplied communist forces fighting the Japanese in China. This meant the only way the Allies could get supplies into the Republic of China was by flying them from British India over the Himalaya Mountains, which were often referred to as the Hump. And they were then sent specifically to the anti-communist or nationalist Chinese of the Republic of China, who, besides fighting the Japanese, were also fighting a civil war against the Chinese communists, with the U.S. and the Soviets, again, supporting opposite sides in the Chinese Civil War, which was still ongoing when the Berlin Airlift began. Number 25. In which we see the Soviets offering food to West Berliners who would transfer their ration cards to Soviet control, was important because transferring one's ration cards to the Soviets essentially meant switching one's allegiance to them, sort of like changing one's citizenship. It also meant becoming dependent on the Soviets, which some people did out of desperation in the early days of the blockade, but most people chose not to do because they didn't like the Soviets or trust them. But one thing, as we see in number 26, many German men were still in Soviet prison camps as German soldiers who were captured and were sent off to Soviet prison camps where they're often treated very badly. In some cases, not allowed to go home until a decade or more after the war ended, and if they survived at all. The Soviet Union had never signed the Geneva Accords on the proper treatment of prisoners of war. The Germans had treated the Soviets so badly when they invaded the Soviet Union. The Soviets treated German POWs terribly too. In some ways, it may have been even worse to be a German captured by the Soviets than to be an American or British soldier captured by the Japanese. Of the German soldiers who surrendered at Stalingrad, for example, only about 5% ever got to go home, and not till about 12 years after their surrender.